At 5:12 every morning, before the lights came on in the 42-story headquarters of Ashford Dynamics, one employee always arrived first and left last. The CEO knew his name from payroll, but she never knew the life waiting for him after he put away his mop. If you have ever felt invisible while carrying responsibilities nobody else could see, let me know where you are watching from. Stories like this remind us that the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens. Daniel Brooks parked his 12-year-old pickup in the far corner of the employee lot because the closer spaces were reserved for executives and clients. He never complained about the extra walk. Instead, he used those few quiet minutes to finish the last sip of coffee from a faded blue travel mug that had survived more winters than he cared to count. Before stepping out, he looked at his phone. 3 messages waited for him, each from a different child. Emma, 14, had sent a picture of the science project she hoped would survive the school bus ride. Noah, 11, wanted to know if there was enough cereal left for breakfast. Little Lily, only 7, had recorded a 10-second voice message that simply said, "Love you, Dad. Do not forget tonight is family reading night." Daniel smiled, listened to her voice twice, and slipped the phone carefully into his jacket pocket as though it were something fragile. Inside the towering glass building, nobody saw those messages. They saw only the janitor pushing an old cleaning cart with one wheel that squeaked every few feet. By 6 o'clock, expensive leather shoes echoed through marble hallways that Daniel had already polished. Executives hurried toward elevators while staring at glowing screens. Some nodded politely. Most never looked up. Invisible people make offices run smoothly. They are noticed only when something goes wrong. Daniel understood that better than anyone. He moved quietly, replacing overflowing trash bags before anyone complained, wiping fingerprints from conference room glass before meetings began, and fixing little things that never appeared on maintenance reports because he believed someone should care, even when nobody else noticed. He carried himself with calm precision, not because someone supervised him, but because 3 children were watching the example he set every single day, even when they were miles away. On the executive floor, Olivia Bennett stepped out of the private elevator exactly at 7:30. As chief executive officer, she had built a reputation for discipline that bordered on legendary. Investors admired her consistency. Employees respected her standards. Newspapers called her one of the country's most effective leaders. Yet very few people knew that every morning she quietly paused beside the framed photograph of her late father before entering her office. It lasted only 3 seconds, just long enough to remember the man who had started the company in a rented warehouse with borrowed tools and impossible dreams. Then the expression disappeared, replaced by the composed confidence expected from someone responsible for thousands of employees. Olivia believed she understood hard work because she had sacrificed weekends, holidays, and nearly every relationship that demanded more time than her calendar could offer. What she did not understand was that there were sacrifices no financial report could measure. Around mid-morning, a department manager stopped Daniel near the executive conference room. A cup of coffee had spilled minutes before an important board meeting. "Can you clean this now?" the manager asked without looking away from his tablet. Daniel answered with the same quiet smile he gave everyone. "Of course." As he knelt to remove the stain from the expensive carpet, board members walked around him without slowing their conversations. Discussions about acquisitions, quarterly forecasts, and market expansion floated above his head, as though he were another piece of office furniture. One executive absent-mindedly rested a briefcase inches from Daniel's shoulder before realizing someone was there. He mumbled a distracted apology and continued talking about profit margins. Daniel simply shifted a little to make room. There was no resentment in his face, only patience practiced over many years. Later that afternoon, Olivia crossed the hallway outside the boardroom, just as Daniel finished repairing a loose baseboard that had bothered him for weeks. She slowed almost imperceptibly. Most maintenance requests took days before appearing on official schedules, yet somehow this small repair had already been completed. She glanced toward him for barely a second. A worn uniform, careful hands, shoes polished despite their age. Then another executive asked her a question, and the moment disappeared. To Olivia, he was simply the janitor who seemed unusually dependable. To Daniel, she was simply the CEO whose busy schedule probably left little room to notice people like him. Neither realized that their lives had already begun moving quietly toward the same story. And the next morning before sunrise, Olivia would see something in the employee parking lot that would make her question everything she thought she knew about the quiet man with the squeaky cleaning cart. The next morning began long before the city woke up. Daniel Brooks was already standing in the tiny kitchen of the two-bedroom apartment he had rented for nearly 8 years. The cabinets had been painted twice, the refrigerator hummed louder than it should, and one dining chair carried a careful repair where the leg had cracked the previous winter. None of it looked perfect, but everything worked because Daniel refused to let his children feel the weight of what they could not afford. While oatmeal simmered on the stove, he quietly packed 3 lunches across the narrow countertop. Emma liked apple slices with a little cinnamon because they stayed fresh longer. Noah always asked for an extra peanut butter sandwich, insisting one of his classmates never brought enough food. Lily preferred her carrots cut into tiny stars, a habit that had started years ago when vegetables seemed less frightening if they looked like something from a bedtime story. Daniel smiled as he pressed the small cookie cutter into each slice. It took another minute every morning, but Lily still laughed every time she opened her lunchbox. Those little laughs were worth more than an extra minute of sleep. Before waking the children, he checked the family calendar taped beside the refrigerator. Emma had a science presentation on Thursday. Noah's basketball permission slip needed to be signed. Lily had circled tonight's family reading hour with bright purple marker and drawn 3 uneven hearts beside it. Daniel touched the paper gently before reaching for his work boots. It had become an unconscious ritual, almost like reminding himself why every exhausting day mattered. The apartment slowly filled with familiar sounds. Emma humming while brushing her hair. Noah searching everywhere for the same backpack he misplaced almost every morning. Lily padding across the hallway in oversized socks, carrying a stuffed rabbit whose ears had been sewn back together so many times that the thread was beginning to show. Daniel never rushed them with raised voices. Instead, he turned ordinary mornings into quiet teamwork. Emma poured milk. Noah gathered lunchboxes. Lily proudly carried napkins to the table, as though she had been trusted with the most important job in the house. By 7 o'clock they were laughing over Noah's attempt to convince everyone that oatmeal tasted better with chocolate chips. Daniel pretended to consider the idea before shaking his head with exaggerated seriousness. "Nice try," he said, earning 3 groans followed by laughter. Moments like these disappeared quickly, but they stayed with him throughout every workday. After dropping the children at school, Daniel drove toward Ashford Dynamics with the windows slightly open, even during cool mornings. Fresh air helped him stay awake after sleeping barely 5 hours. His pickup made a faint rattling sound every time he crossed railroad tracks. He knew exactly where it came from. Someday he would fix it himself. Today there were more important things to pay for. At work, Daniel treated every floor as though someone he loved would be walking through it. When he noticed a loose floor tile near the accounting department, he repaired it before anyone tripped. When an elderly mail carrier struggled with heavy packages, Daniel quietly carried them upstairs without waiting to be asked. He learned the names of security guards, receptionists, delivery drivers, and cafeteria workers because he believed people deserved to be remembered. Months earlier, one receptionist had mentioned her mother's surgery. Daniel still asked how she was recovering whenever they crossed paths. Small kindnesses cost almost nothing, yet they seemed to surprise people more than expensive gifts ever could. Around lunchtime he usually sat alone outside behind the maintenance entrance where a narrow strip of shade protected one weathered picnic table. Instead of scrolling through his phone, he opened whatever library book Lily had insisted he borrow for family reading night. Sometimes it was a children's mystery, sometimes an old adventure novel. He underlined favorite sentences with a pencil because Lily loved hearing them again before bed. On Fridays, Noah joined him through video call during recess whenever school rules allowed. Their conversations rarely lasted more than 3 minutes. They talked about spelling tests, scraped knees, basketball practice, and whether the tomato plant on their apartment balcony might finally grow something worth eating. Those tiny conversations became anchors in Daniel's day. They reminded him that no matter how invisible he felt inside the company, somewhere 3 children still believed he could solve almost any problem. Olivia Bennett noticed none of this directly. She saw reports, attendance records, and performance metrics. She appreciated employees who worked reliably, And Daniel's file reflected exactly that. Perfect attendance. No complaints. Excellent maintenance reviews. To her, those numbers described a dependable employee. They could not describe the father who quietly skipped replacing his own winter coat so Emma could attend a school science competition, or the man who spent Sunday evenings teaching multiplication with dried beans because expensive tutoring was impossible. Numbers never told stories like that. Late one afternoon, as Daniel emptied recycling bins outside the executive offices, he paused to return a tiny knitted mitten that had fallen from a visitor's purse earlier that day. He placed it neatly on the reception desk with a handwritten note that simply read, "Someone will be happy this was found." The receptionist smiled, shaking her head. "You always notice the little things, Daniel." He answered with his usual gentle shrug. Little things usually matter the most. Neither of them realized Olivia Bennett had just stepped out of a nearby conference room in time to hear those words. She glanced toward Daniel for only a brief moment before continuing down the hallway. Yet something about his calm voice lingered in her thoughts longer than she expected. That evening, after everyone else had left, a confidential email marked executive priority arrived in Olivia's inbox requesting an immediate review of company-wide staffing costs. Buried deep inside the attached proposal was a single recommendation that seemed almost insignificant at first glance: outsource all custodial services before the end of the quarter. Olivia Bennett had spent 15 years proving that discipline could accomplish what talent alone never could. Newspapers liked to describe her as fearless, investors admired her consistency, and business magazines praised the calm precision with which she led Ashford Dynamics through recessions, supply chain crises, and volatile markets. Those stories were not wrong. They were simply incomplete. Very few people knew that Olivia still kept the first employee handbook her father had written by hand when the company occupied a converted warehouse on the edge of town. The worn binder rested inside the bottom drawer of her office credenza, its pages stained with coffee rings and penciled notes. Whenever the pressure became overwhelming, she sometimes opened it to the first page where one sentence had been underlined decades earlier: "Take care of good people, and good people will take care of the company." She believed those words with all her heart. The problem was that success had gradually surrounded her with layers of reports, presentations, consultants, and managers who translated human lives into charts and percentages. She still wanted to understand her employees, but the company had grown beyond the point where one person could know thousands of individual stories. Every morning began with financial dashboards instead of conversations. Every afternoon filled with board meetings instead of walking factory floors. Every evening ended with another stack of decisions affecting people she would probably never meet. Somewhere along the way, efficiency had quietly become the language everyone around her spoke. Her chief financial officer, Martin Ellis, believed numbers told the truth more clearly than emotions ever could. He was not a cruel man. In fact, outside the office he volunteered with the literacy program and rarely missed his daughter's soccer games. Inside the boardroom, however, he viewed every expense through the lens of long-term sustainability. Custodial services appeared on quarterly spreadsheets as labor costs, vendor comparisons, and projected savings. Martin never imagined the names behind those payroll lines because he assumed department managers already understood the people involved. Human resources reviewed performance. Operations reviewed staffing. Finance reviewed cost. Each division trusted another to carry the human side of the equation. The system worked remarkably well until someone quietly slipped between its cracks. During the executive meeting that followed, Martin projected a slide titled Operational Efficiency Initiative. Outsourcing non-core services, he explained, could reduce annual operating expenses by nearly $2 million without affecting customer experience. Security contracts had already been renegotiated. Landscaping had been outsourced years earlier. Custodial services represented the next logical step. Around the conference table, several directors nodded. The proposal sounded reasonable because it was built on careful research. National vendors offered lower costs through scale. Existing employees could apply for positions with the outside contractor. On paper, almost everyone would keep working. Olivia studied the presentation without interrupting. She asked detailed questions about transition timelines, quality control, and employee retention rates. Martin answered each one confidently, supported by charts and industry benchmarks. Nothing about the proposal suggested carelessness. Nothing suggested malice. It reflected the kind of recommendation responsible executives made every day. Yet Olivia found herself thinking about something else entirely. She remembered the maintenance hallway from the previous afternoon. A quiet janitor returning a child's mitten with a handwritten note. Little things usually matter the most. The sentence drifted back unexpectedly before disappearing beneath another discussion about operating margins. Across the building, Daniel finished repairing a loose cabinet hinge in the employee break room. No one had requested the repair. He had simply noticed the door hanging unevenly and fixed it before someone pinched a finger. As he packed away his tools, the receptionist stopped by carrying 2 unopened boxes of school supplies donated after a company volunteer event. "They're sending these to storage," she said. "Do you know any families that could use them?" Daniel hesitated for only a second before smiling. "Our neighborhood community center always needs notebooks. If nobody has claimed them, I can drop them off after work." The receptionist thanked him, unaware that Daniel had quietly purchased most of Emma's school supplies secondhand only weeks earlier. He never considered taking the boxes home first. Someone else might need them even more. Late that afternoon, Olivia decided to walk through several departments without an entourage, something she had not done in months. Employees straightened instinctively when they noticed her approaching, but she tried to make each conversation feel ordinary. She asked an engineer about a prototype, congratulated a receptionist on a recent service award, and thanked warehouse staff for meeting an important shipment deadline. As she rounded a corner near the administrative offices, she noticed Daniel kneeling beside an elderly employee's rolling chair. One wheel had jammed. Rather than replacing the chair with a newer model from storage, Daniel patiently cleaned the axle, tightened 2 worn screws, and tested the movement across the floor. The employee laughed as the chair rolled smoothly again. "You saved me from another afternoon of fighting that thing," Daniel simply answered. "It still has plenty of good years left." Olivia watched from several yards away before continuing toward the elevator. It was a tiny interaction, almost forgettable, yet she found herself wondering why someone who cared that much about details seemed completely invisible inside such a large organization. When she returned to her office, her assistant informed her that the board expected a recommendation on the outsourcing proposal before the end of the week. Olivia looked through the executive summary once more, then picked up a pen and wrote a single note in the margin beside the custodial section. "Visit night shift before final approval." It was a small decision that no one else in the room considered important. But before that visit could happen, an unexpected staffing emergency on the evening shift would place Daniel Brooks directly in the path of the biggest decision of his working life. Daniel Brooks had never believed that doing the right thing guaranteed an easier life. If anything, experience had taught him the opposite. The right choice usually demanded another hour of work, another night's sleep sacrificed, or another quiet compromise that nobody else would ever notice. Still, every evening before leaving Ashford Dynamics, he followed the same routine. He walked every hallway one last time, checking that emergency exits remained clear, water fountains were not leaking, and nothing had been left where someone could trip the following morning. It was not listed in his job description. Nobody inspected that final walkthrough. Daniel simply imagined hundreds of employees arriving the next day without ever thinking about the people who prepared the building while they slept. Somehow that thought made the extra 20 minutes feel worthwhile. That Tuesday evening, however, the building refused to settle into its usual rhythm. Around 7:30, while most office lights had gone dark, Daniel noticed a faint smell drifting from the records archive on the 12th floor. It was not smoke exactly, more like the sharp scent of overheated plastic mixed with warm dust. Years of maintaining older buildings had taught him to trust small changes before they became large problems. He pushed his cleaning cart aside and quietly followed the smell until he reached a storage room where several backup document scanners and networking cabinets shared the same electrical circuit. One cabinet emitted a barely audible buzzing sound. A tiny indicator light flickered irregularly instead of glowing steadily. Daniel crouched beside it without touching anything immediately. He listened first. His late wife had once teased him for doing that with every strange appliance in their apartment. "You always listen before you fix," she used to laugh. "Machines tell you what's wrong if you're patient." The memory crossed his mind for only a heartbeat before he opened the maintenance panel. Inside, one power connector had partially melted. It had not failed completely, but another hour under full load could have caused serious equipment damage. Daniel reached instinctively for the emergency maintenance phone mounted beside the wall. The proper procedure required notifying the facility's contractor, waiting for authorization, documenting the issue, and leaving the equipment untouched until a licensed technician arrived. Under normal circumstances, that process protected both employees and company property. Tonight was different. Through the hallway windows, he could see dozens of lights still glowing on executive floors. The board's financial review continued late into the evening. The servers connected to that cabinet were supporting live document access for multiple departments. If power failed suddenly, hours of work might disappear, and restoring the damaged equipment would become far more complicated than preventing the failure now. Daniel looked back at the connector, then at the emergency phone, then at the framed maintenance policy hanging beside it. Rules existed for good reasons, but responsibility sometimes asked harder questions than policy manuals could answer. He picked up the phone anyway. The emergency contractor estimated at least 90 minutes before anyone could arrive, because another commercial building across town had already requested priority service after storm damage. Daniel thanked the dispatcher, wrote down the incident number, and slowly returned the receiver to its cradle. 90 minutes was too long. He knew it. The humming inside the cabinet had grown louder. Carefully, using insulated gloves and approved lockout procedures he had learned years earlier during certification training, Daniel isolated the affected circuit, transferred the load to the secondary backup line, and replaced the damaged connector from spare components stored in the maintenance workshop. He documented every step with photographs on the company maintenance tablet, noting exactly why he had acted before contractor arrival. The repair itself lasted less than 20 minutes. Restarting the system required another 15. When the cabinet finally resumed its steady, healthy hum, Daniel allowed himself one quiet breath of relief. The building never noticed how close it had come to losing an important section of its network. Somewhere upstairs, executives continued reviewing financial reports without interruption. Their presentations remained open. Their data stayed intact. Their evening proceeded exactly as planned because someone downstairs had prevented a problem before it announced itself. Daniel packed away his tools, fully aware that he had also violated protocol by performing a repair reserved for outside contractors. He understood the possible consequences. A supervisor might argue that he had exceeded his authority. Legal staff might insist only approved vendors perform electrical work, regardless of his training. If disciplinary action followed, Daniel would accept it. 3 children depended on his paycheck, yet he could not convince himself that watching equipment fail while waiting 90 minutes would have been the more responsible choice. He finished writing the maintenance report with unusual care, refusing to hide anything. Every photograph remained attached. Every timestamp stayed accurate. He even included the dispatch reference number showing when he had first requested outside assistance. If someone questioned his decision later, he wanted the truth to answer before he did. Near 9 o'clock, Daniel finally wheeled his cleaning cart toward the service elevator. He still had the donated school supply boxes in the back of his pickup, planning to drop them at the neighborhood community center before heading home. Lily would already be asleep by the time he arrived. Family reading night would have to wait until tomorrow. That disappointment weighed on him more heavily than any possible conversation with management. As the elevator doors closed, another set of doors opened quietly across the hallway. Olivia Bennett stepped onto the executive floor after returning from a dinner meeting that had ended earlier than expected. She intended only to collect a forgotten folder before driving home. Instead, she noticed unusual activity outside the records archive. The maintenance cabinet stood open. Fresh replacement parts rested neatly on a work mat. Beside them lay a completed incident report waiting for morning review. Olivia read only the first few lines before seeing the employee's signature at the bottom. Daniel Brooks. She said nothing. She touched none of the paperwork. She simply looked from the repaired cabinet to the careful documentation, then toward the empty hallway where the janitor had disappeared moments before. Without realizing it, Olivia had just become the first person inside Ashford Dynamics to witness evidence that the quiet man everyone overlooked consistently carried responsibilities far beyond what anyone expected. The following morning, Daniel arrived at Ashford Dynamics with the same quiet routine that had shaped nearly every weekday of the last 8 years. He parked in the same distant corner of the employee lot, finished the last sip of lukewarm coffee, and listened to Lily's new voice message before stepping out of his truck. "Daddy," she whispered excitedly, trying not to wake her older sister, "my reading bookmark is finished. You have to see it tonight." Daniel smiled despite the exhaustion pressing behind his eyes. He promised himself he would be home early enough this time. It was a promise he genuinely wanted to keep. Inside the building, however, the atmosphere felt subtly different. Conversation stopped for a moment when he entered the maintenance office. His supervisor, Carl Jensen, stood beside the bulletin board holding a printed incident report. Carl was a practical man who believed strongly in following procedure because he had seen too many preventable accidents during his 30 years in facilities management. He respected Daniel's work ethic, but this morning concern outweighed familiarity. "My office," Carl said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, only tension. Daniel nodded without asking questions. The incident report lay open across Carl's desk. Every photograph Daniel had submitted remained attached exactly as he had uploaded them. The damaged connector, the emergency dispatch record, the replacement part, the completed repair. Carl rubbed his forehead before speaking. "You know company policy." "I do." "Then why didn't you wait?" Daniel answered without defensiveness. "Because the contractor couldn't arrive for at least 90 minutes. Carl sighed. "That isn't the question legal will ask." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before replying. "I know." Silence filled the room. Neither man enjoyed where the conversation was heading. Carl finally leaned back in his chair. "They're reviewing everything upstairs. Until then, don't discuss this with anyone." Daniel thanked him and returned to work exactly as he had every other morning. He did not complain. He did not attempt to justify himself in the hallway. He simply continued replacing trash liners, polishing elevator doors, and repairing the ordinary things that quietly kept the building running. By mid-morning, whispers had already begun spreading through maintenance staff. Nobody knew the complete story. Someone claimed Daniel had tampered with executive equipment. Another insisted he had bypassed safety regulations. A third employee confidently declared that outside auditors had become involved. Like most workplace rumors, every retelling drifted a little farther from reality. Daniel overheard fragments while refilling supply closets. He kept walking. Defending himself against incomplete stories rarely changed anyone's opinion before the facts existed. Around noon, he entered the employee cafeteria carrying the same faded lunch container he had used for years. Several seats remained open, yet conversations grew noticeably quieter as he passed. No one openly accused him of anything. No one insulted him directly, but uncertainty created distance all by itself. Daniel chose his usual table near the back window overlooking the loading dock. He unfolded a paper napkin, opened yesterday's leftover chicken soup, and pulled a small envelope from his jacket pocket. Inside were 3 drawings folded carefully to avoid wrinkles. Emma had sketched a microscope for her science presentation. Noah had drawn the first tomato beginning to grow on the apartment balcony. Lily's picture showed 4 stick figures holding hands beneath an oversized yellow sun. Above them she had written in uneven letters, "Our family always stays together." Daniel looked at the drawings one by one before placing them back inside the envelope. He never noticed the cafeteria employee watching quietly from across the room. She had served him lunch for years and had often seen him smile at those same folded papers before returning to work. To everyone else he appeared to be eating alone. She saw a father spending his lunch break with his children in the only way he could. Upstairs, the executive leadership meeting had shifted unexpectedly. The discussion about outsourcing custodial services was temporarily postponed, while legal counsel reviewed Daniel's maintenance report. Martin Ellis remained concerned. The outcome happened to be positive, he explained carefully. But policies exist because individual judgment cannot become the standard. Olivia listened without interrupting. She understood the principle. Large organizations depended upon consistent rules. Yet something continued bothering her. She requested the original maintenance records instead of the summary prepared for executives. When the files arrived, she noticed details most readers would probably overlook. Daniel had called the emergency contractor before taking any action. He had documented every step. He had photographed his own work without attempting to hide the unauthorized repair. Most importantly, he had signed the report immediately instead of waiting to see whether anyone would notice. None of those actions resembled someone trying to avoid responsibility. They resembled someone prepared to accept it. Even so, policies remain policies. Olivia could not ignore that reality simply because the outcome had been favorable. Late that afternoon, Daniel received a message asking him to report to Human Resources the following morning. No explanation accompanied the meeting request. Carl avoided making promises he could not keep. "Maybe they're gathering information," he said quietly. "Maybe." Daniel nodded. He appreciated the honesty more than false reassurance. After clocking out, he drove directly to the community center and unloaded the donated school supplies exactly as he had promised. The director thanked him warmly, assuming the supplies had come from his employer. Daniel gently corrected her. "The company donated them. I just happened to be the one delivering them." He never mentioned that he could have kept half the notebooks for his own children without anyone knowing. On the drive home, his truck passed a sporting goods store displaying brand new baseball gloves in the front window. Daniel slowed almost instinctively. Noah's old glove had split along one seam weeks earlier. Daniel had repaired it twice already. He checked his wallet at the next traffic light, quietly calculated upcoming bills, and continued driving. The repaired glove would have to last a little longer. That evening after dinner, Emma practiced her presentation while Noah watered the tomato plant, and Lily proudly showed everyone her handmade reading bookmark. Daniel listened to each child with complete attention, never allowing tomorrow's uncertainty to steal tonight's ordinary joy. Once the children had fallen asleep, he quietly ironed his only dress shirt for the Human Resources meeting. Its collar showed slight wear despite careful washing. As he hung it beside the closet door, his phone vibrated with an email notification from work. Expecting another scheduling reminder, Daniel glanced briefly at the screen before setting it aside unopened. He never realized the message had been copied automatically to Olivia Bennett as part of the executive review process. Attached to it was a scanned maintenance certification earned years earlier, one that documented advanced electrical safety training, far beyond the responsibilities listed in his current janitorial position. Olivia noticed the attachment only because the certification date caught her eye. She clicked on the file almost absent-mindedly, unaware that the first missing piece of Daniel Brooks's story had finally begun to reveal itself. The alarm sounded at 4:38 the next morning, but Daniel Brooks was already awake. For several quiet minutes he simply lay still, listening. The apartment had its own language before sunrise. The refrigerator hummed with a tired persistence. A water pipe clicked softly inside the wall. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck shifted gears before disappearing into the distance. Behind the thin bedroom door, 3 children breathed with the peaceful rhythm that only deep sleep could create. Daniel had come to treasure those sounds more than silence itself. They reminded him that, despite every uncertainty waiting beyond the apartment walls, everyone he loved was still safe under the same roof. He slipped out of bed without turning on the overhead light. Instead, he relied on the faint blue glow filtering through the kitchen window. Years of early mornings had taught him exactly where every chair, cabinet, and floorboard waited in the darkness. He folded the blanket neatly across the sofa where he often slept whenever one of the children became sick during the night. Then he filled the old kettle with water and placed it carefully on the stove. The whistle never had a chance to sound. He always removed it seconds before, unwilling to wake the children any earlier than necessary. While the oatmeal slowly cooked, Daniel opened the apartment window just enough to let the cool autumn air drift inside. It carried the scent of damp leaves after last night's rain. On the tiny balcony outside, Noah's tomato plant leaned slightly toward the morning light. Only 3 tomatoes had survived the season, each still small and stubbornly green. Daniel straightened the cracked wooden support holding the plant upright, securing it again with the same piece of twine he had reused twice already. Nothing in the apartment was discarded until it had truly reached the end of its usefulness. Emma often teased him that he could probably repair the moon if someone handed him a ladder. He always laughed, though secretly he hoped his children would remember something more important than his repairs. He hoped they would remember that caring for things also meant caring for people. The children woke one by one. Emma quietly reviewed flashcards while eating breakfast. Noah tied and retied the worn laces on his sneakers because he wanted them to look presentable despite the fading fabric. Lily carried her stuffed rabbit beneath one arm and her new reading bookmark in the other hand. Before anyone left the apartment, Daniel gathered them near the front door as he always did. It lasted no more than 15 seconds. "Be kind," he said softly. "Pay attention. Help someone if you can." Emma answered automatically, smiling as she had hundreds of mornings before. "And come home together." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." It was less a family rule than a promise they made to one another every day. After dropping the children at school, Daniel remained parked outside for another minute longer than usual. Parents hurried toward work. School buses pulled away. Children disappeared through wide glass doors carrying backpacks almost larger than themselves. Daniel watched until he saw Lily wave one last time from the hallway window. Only then did he start the truck. At Ashford Dynamics, the building seemed unchanged. Glass reflected the pale morning sky. Coffee brewed behind reception. Elevators chimed at regular intervals. Yet Daniel sensed the invisible weight that often settled over workplaces after difficult conversations. Employees greeted him politely, though with a trace of careful hesitation. He responded exactly as he always had. A smile, a quiet good morning, a willingness to hold the elevator even when nobody thanked him. Routine became its own form of courage. Every familiar task grounded him. He polished fingerprints from conference room glass until sunlight stretched across the surface without interruption. He watered the neglected fern outside the accounting office because nobody else remembered it needed attention twice each week. He straightened picture frames that had drifted slightly crooked after months of passing footsteps caused tiny vibrations through the walls. No one assigned those details. Daniel simply noticed them. Shortly before noon, he found himself alone in the maintenance workshop waiting for replacement filters to arrive. The room carried the comforting scent of machine oil, clean cotton rags, and old pine shelves worn smooth by decades of use. Above the workbench hung a clock that lost nearly 2 minutes every month. Daniel had never replaced it. Instead, once every few weeks, he quietly adjusted the hands before anyone realized the time had drifted. The clock reminded him that small corrections made consistently could keep almost anything moving in the right direction. He unfolded Lily's reading bookmark from his pocket. She had colored tiny blue stars along the edges and written one sentence across the middle in careful block letters. "Every story gets brighter." Daniel traced the words gently with his thumb before sliding the bookmark back into place. For the first time since receiving the Human Resources meeting notice, he closed his eyes. Not to escape, only to breathe. The workshop remained perfectly still except for the slow turning of the ventilation fan overhead. Outside, distant footsteps crossed polished hallways. Someone laughed several rooms away. A delivery cart rolled across tile before fading into silence again. Daniel opened his eyes and returned to work. That afternoon, Olivia Bennett postponed 2 non-essential meetings and remained inside her office longer than usual. Daniel's maintenance certification still rested on the corner of her desk beside the original incident report. She had intended only to verify his qualifications before the Human Resources review. Instead, she found herself reading every document twice. His personnel file described an employee with nearly flawless attendance, consistently excellent evaluations, and years without a single disciplinary concern. His training records revealed certifications well beyond what his current position required. His supervisors repeatedly praised not only the quality of his work, but also his willingness to help departments outside his assigned responsibilities. Curiously, there were almost no requests initiated by Daniel himself, no applications for promotion, no complaints, no demands for recognition. It was as though he had spent years quietly supporting everyone else while asking almost nothing in return. Olivia leaned back from her desk and looked through the office window toward the city below. Thousands of people moved through the afternoon traffic, each carrying lives no spreadsheet could ever explain. Her father's old employee handbook remained inside the bottom drawer where it had always been. She opened it once again and stopped at the sentence he had underlined decades earlier. Take care of good people, and good people will take care of the company. For the first time in many years, Olivia found herself wondering whether she had become so accustomed to measuring performance that she had slowly stopped seeing the people hidden behind it. Across the hall, her executive assistant knocked softly before entering with the finalized agenda for the following morning's human resources review. Olivia accepted the folder, but instead of placing it on the growing stack of paperwork, she asked a question that surprised even herself. Has anyone ever actually spoken with Daniel Brooks about his life outside of work? The assistant hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. I do not think anyone ever has. Olivia looked once more toward the maintenance corridor where the quiet janitor had disappeared only minutes earlier. Something deep inside her resisted the comfortable explanation everyone else seemed ready to accept. For reasons she could not yet explain, she was beginning to suspect that the story surrounding Daniel Brooks was far more complete and far more human than anyone inside Ashford Dynamics had taken the time to discover. The Human Resources meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on Friday morning. Daniel Brooks arrived 15 minutes early, not because he believed punctuality would change the outcome, but because arriving late had never been an option in his mind. He wore the only dress shirt he owned, the one he had carefully ironed the night before after his children had fallen asleep. The cuffs were beginning to fray, and the collar had softened after years of careful washing, yet it was spotless. Before entering the building, Daniel sat quietly inside his truck for a moment, listening to 3 familiar voice messages. Emma wished him luck on whatever important meeting grown-ups have. Noah reminded him not to forget the tomato plant needed watering after work. Lily simply said, "Daddy, you always tell us that telling the truth is never the wrong choice." Daniel smiled gently before locking his phone. Those words stayed with him as he walked through the front entrance. Upstairs, Olivia Bennett had been awake since before dawn, but not because of quarterly reports or shareholder expectations. Daniel's personnel file remained open across her dining table beside the faded employee handbook that had belonged to her father. Throughout the previous evening, she had requested additional records, not to build a case against him, but because too many small details refused to fit together. His maintenance certifications, 8 consecutive years of perfect attendance, dozens of handwritten notes from department managers thanking him for solving problems outside his assigned duties. Security logs showing he regularly arrived earlier than anyone required. Volunteer sign-in sheets from company charity events where Daniel had quietly stayed long after official photographs were taken. None of those records alone revealed much. Together, however, they painted the outline of someone whose character extended far beyond the title of janitor. One document in particular held Olivia's attention. It had never appeared in executive summaries because it belonged to human resources rather than operations. 6 years earlier, Daniel had quietly declined an internal promotion to building maintenance supervisor. The position paid considerably more and included better hours. His written explanation occupied only 2 sentences. "I appreciate the opportunity. My current schedule allows me to take my children to school every morning and be available when they need me. At this stage of life, that flexibility matters more than the promotion." Olivia read those sentences several times. There was no mention of sacrifice, no complaint, no request for sympathy, simply a father making a decision that made sense only after someone understood what mattered most to him. Curious, Olivia requested archived benefit records. Human Resources hesitated because the information was private, but company policy allowed executive review when employment decisions were pending. The file answered questions she had not even known to ask. Daniel had added 3 dependents to his health insurance shortly after his wife passed away. Every enrollment form had been completed perfectly. Every premium had been paid on time. He had never requested hardship assistance, never applied for emergency leave beyond what was absolutely necessary, and never submitted reimbursement requests for programs the company quietly offered employees raising children alone. He had carried every responsibility himself while asking for almost nothing. The final piece arrived unexpectedly from the payroll manager, who apologized for sending additional information during an already busy morning. "I thought you should know," she explained. "Mr. Brooks has donated unused vacation hours to coworkers with medical emergencies 4 different times." Olivia looked up from the report. "Donated?" The manager nodded. "Employees can transfer unused leave under special circumstances. Most people never do because those hours have real financial value. Daniel always volunteered anonymously. We only know because payroll has to process the paperwork." Olivia stared silently at the page. Suddenly, dozens of tiny memories connected in ways they never had before. The repaired office chair. The carefully returned child's mitten. The donated school supplies he delivered without taking credit. The maintenance repair he had fully documented even though it might cost him his job. The worn lunch container. The quiet smile that never seemed to depend on whether anyone noticed him. Every small act reflected the same invisible pattern. Daniel never chose the option that benefited himself first. Across the hall, the Human Resources conference room slowly filled. Carl Jensen waited with visible concern. Martin Ellis reviewed policy documents one final time. The legal advisor organized compliance notes. Daniel entered exactly on time, greeted everyone politely, and took the nearest chair without attempting to defend himself before questions began. Olivia remained in her office for another minute, holding Lily's handmade bookmark that had somehow slipped from Daniel's personnel folder after being photographed as part of the incident review. Someone in Human Resources had apparently included it accidentally, while scanning documents found inside his jacket pocket after the maintenance report was submitted. Tiny blue stars covered the edges. Across the center, written in a child's careful handwriting, were 5 simple words. "Every story gets brighter, Daddy." Olivia turned the bookmark over. On the back, another sentence appeared in smaller letters. "Thank you for always coming home." She closed her eyes. In that quiet moment, the building around her seemed strangely different. The polished floors no longer represented immaculate facilities. They represented mornings that began before sunrise so 3 children could sleep a little longer. The spotless conference rooms no longer reflected efficient operations. They reflected evenings when a father missed family reading night because someone else's workplace needed to be ready by morning. The financial reports discussing custodial expenses no longer described budget categories. They described people whose lives extended far beyond the uniform they wore to work. Olivia finally understood what had been missing from every presentation placed on her desk. None of them measured character. None of them measured quiet sacrifice. None of them measured the extraordinary dignity hidden inside ordinary routines. She stood, picked up Daniel's personnel file, the maintenance report, the bookmark, and her father's worn employee handbook. Then, instead of walking toward the executive conference room where the leadership team expected her recommendation, she turned in the opposite direction. She instructed her assistant to delay the meeting, cancel the prepared agenda, and ask everyone to wait. "Where are you going?" the assistant asked softly. Olivia looked toward the maintenance corridor before answering. "Before anyone makes another decision about Daniel Brooks," she said, "I am going to hear his story from him. Not from a file, not from a report, and not from anyone else." No one inside Ashford Dynamics had expected the company's chief executive officer to postpone an executive review for a janitor. Yet that was exactly what Olivia Bennett had just decided to do. The conference room felt unexpectedly quiet when Olivia Bennett walked in carrying neither a presentation nor a recommendation. Instead, she placed 4 simple items on the polished table before taking her seat. Daniel Brooks's maintenance report, his personnel file, the faded employee handbook her father had written decades earlier, and a small handmade bookmark covered with blue stars. Around the table, executives exchanged uncertain glances. Martin Ellis was the first to speak. "Are we still reviewing the policy violation?" Olivia looked at him calmly. "Yes," she answered. "But before we decide what kind of employee Daniel Brooks is, I think we should first understand what kind of person he is." Moments later, Daniel entered the room after being invited personally, rather than summoned through Human Resources. The difference was subtle, but everyone noticed it. Olivia stood as he walked in. So did Carl Jensen. Then, almost instinctively, every other person around the table followed. Daniel hesitated near the doorway, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. "Mr. Brooks," Olivia said gently, "thank you for coming." Daniel nodded politely. "Of course." She motioned toward an empty chair beside the conference table. Daniel remained standing. "I'd rather stand if that's all right." "If that's what makes you comfortable," Olivia replied. For a moment nobody spoke. The room that usually filled with confident presentations suddenly felt strangely human. Olivia finally broke the silence. "I spent the last 24 hours reading reports about your work. Then I realized none of those reports actually described you." Daniel lowered his eyes slightly, unsure where the conversation was leading. Olivia lifted the maintenance report first. "You called the emergency contractor before touching the equipment." Daniel nodded. "Yes." "You documented every step." "Yes." "You signed your own report immediately, even though you knew it might create problems." It was the truth. There was no pride in his answer, only quiet certainty. Olivia placed the report back on the table. Then she opened the personnel file. "6 years ago you turned down a promotion." Daniel smiled faintly. "My children were younger." "You never explained that to anyone." "No one asked." Another silence settled across the room. It felt heavier now, not with accusation but with reflection. Olivia picked up the little bookmark next. "This belongs to your daughter." Daniel's expression changed immediately. Not fear, not embarrassment, simply the unmistakable softness that appeared whenever someone mentioned his children. "She made it for family reading night," he said quietly. "She likes drawing stars." Olivia looked around the table before speaking again. "For years we've measured Mr. Brooks by attendance records, job titles, and payroll categories." She paused. "What we failed to measure was character." No one interrupted. Even Martin remained silent. Olivia closed her father's handbook and rested one hand on its worn cover. "My father wrote one sentence in this book that built this company long before any of us were here." She looked directly at Daniel before reading aloud. "Take care of good people, and good people will take care of the company." She closed the handbook again. Mr. Brooks has been living those words every day. The rest of us simply stopped noticing. Olivia stood, walked around the conference table, and stopped in front of Daniel. There was no audience beyond the handful of people in the room. No cameras. No press release waiting outside. She extended both hands. "Daniel." It was the first time anyone in executive leadership had called him by his first name. "I owe you more than an apology." Daniel accepted the handshake with the same quiet humility he offered everyone. Olivia continued. "Your maintenance decision did not violate the values of this company. It honored them." She turned toward the others. "The procedure will be reviewed because our policies should support responsible judgment, not discourage it." Martin looked thoughtful before speaking. "I focused entirely on the rule." Olivia nodded. "And I focused too long on reports instead of people." Daniel answered softly before anyone else could continue. "Policies matter. They protect everyone." Olivia smiled. "You're right. If I had made the wrong decision, I should have accepted the consequences. And because you accepted responsibility instead of hiding from it, you've reminded us what responsibility actually looks like." She reached for another folder lying on the table. "Effective immediately. The outsourcing proposal for custodial services is withdrawn." Several executives looked surprised, but none objected. Olivia continued. "Not because of one employee. Because we clearly do not understand the value of the people who keep this company running." She turned back toward Daniel. "I would also like to offer you the maintenance supervisor position again." Daniel remained quiet for several seconds before answering. "May I ask one question?" "Of course." "Would I still be able to take my children to school every morning?" Olivia smiled warmly. "Not under the old schedule." Daniel nodded politely. "Then I can't accept it." No disappointment appeared in his voice, only honesty. Several people around the table lowered their eyes. They finally understood that this had never been about ambition. Olivia thought for only a moment. Then she looked toward human resources. "Create a new schedule." The director blinked. "A new schedule?" "Yes." Olivia answered without hesitation. "If we've learned anything today, It's that good people shouldn't have to choose between serving this company well and being present for the people who need them most. Daniel looked genuinely surprised for the first time all morning. You do that? Olivia smiled. No. She gently shook her head. We should have done it years ago. That afternoon, no company-wide announcement celebrated the meeting. There was no dramatic speech in the lobby. Instead, small things quietly began to change. Department managers started learning the names of employees they usually passed without noticing. The outsourcing proposal disappeared from the board agenda. The old maintenance clock in Daniel's workshop was replaced, not because it was broken, but because someone finally realized the man adjusting it every month deserved a clock that kept perfect time. When Daniel finished his shift, he picked up the new clock's empty box, smiled to himself, and placed Lily's Blue Star bookmark carefully inside his lunch container before driving home. As the sun settled behind rows of neighborhood trees, 3 children were already waiting at the apartment window, searching every passing truck until they saw the familiar old pickup turning slowly into the parking lot. The following Monday morning, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the glass walls of Ashford Dynamics just as they had every other weekday. The parking lot looked the same. Employees hurried toward the entrance with coffee cups in one hand and phones in the other. Elevators opened and closed with familiar chimes. From a distance, nothing appeared different. Yet the people inside the building had quietly begun changing in ways no quarterly report would ever record. Daniel Brooks parked in his usual space at the far end of the lot. Even after everything that had happened, he chose the longer walk. Old habits built from gratitude were not easily replaced. Halfway to the entrance, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Martin Ellis. The chief financial officer slowed until they walked side by side. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Martin smiled with quiet humility. Good morning, Daniel. It was the first time he had ever addressed him by name. Daniel smiled back. Good morning. They continued walking together, not as executives and custodial staff, but simply as 2 people beginning another day of honest work. Inside the lobby, receptionists greeted Daniel before he greeted them. Security officers waved. An engineer stopped to ask how Emma's science presentation had gone after hearing about it from another employee. Daniel answered with the same modest pride any father would carry. She did better than she thought she would. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but something remarkable had happened. People no longer saw only the uniform. They saw the man wearing it. Olivia Bennett watched quietly from the mezzanine above. She had not instructed anyone to behave differently. Respect could never be ordered from the executive office. It had to grow naturally once people truly saw one another. She smiled softly before returning to her own work, carrying her father's worn handbook beneath one arm. Later that afternoon, Daniel unlocked the maintenance workshop and stopped in surprise. Above the clean workbench hung a simple wooden plaque. It was not polished brass or expensive crystal, just solid oak with carefully carved lettering. Beneath his name were 4 words. Thank you for caring. There was no title, no award, no ceremony, only a reminder that the countless little things he had done for years had finally been noticed. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the edge of the plaque before returning to work. He did not need applause. Being understood was enough. That evening, he left the building on time. For the first time in years, he did not feel guilty for walking out before another unnecessary task could keep him late. Someone else had already volunteered to finish the last hallway inspection, because they had quietly decided that Daniel deserved to get home when he promised his children he would. As his old pickup rolled into the apartment parking lot, 3 familiar faces appeared instantly at the second-floor window. Noah nearly forgot to open the front door before running downstairs. Emma carried her science ribbon with quiet excitement. Lily held the Blue Star bookmark in one hand and her favorite library book in the other. You made it, she shouted before Daniel had even turned off the engine. He laughed, lifting her into his arms. I told you I'd be home. Upstairs, dinner was wonderfully ordinary. Bowls of homemade soup steamed gently across the small table. Noah proudly announced that one tomato on the balcony had finally turned red. Emma described every question her teacher had asked after the presentation. Lily insisted Daniel use the bookmark exactly as promised because good stories always need good bookmarks. As they read together, The apartment filled with the same familiar sounds that had comforted Daniel before sunrise only days earlier. Laughter. Turning pages. 3 children interrupting the story with far too many questions. He would not have traded that noise for all the quiet conference rooms in the world. Across town, Olivia sat alone in her office after most employees had gone home. Before leaving, she opened her father's handbook one last time. Beneath the sentence he had underlined years before, she added another line in her own handwriting. Never become so busy measuring performance that you forget to recognize character. She closed the book gently, switched off the office lights, and walked out through the same front doors her father once used when the company had only a handful of employees. Some legacies were built through profits. Others were built by remembering the dignity of ordinary people. The next morning, the old maintenance clock in Daniel's workshop kept perfect time. The tomato on the balcony ripened a little more in the autumn sun. Lily's Blue Star bookmark rested safely inside the family novel, marking another chapter they would finish together that evening. And somewhere between a polished hallway, a father's quiet promise, and a child waiting by a window, an invisible man was invisible no longer. If this story reminded you of someone whose quiet kindness often goes unnoticed, I hope you'll carry their name with you today. Sometimes the greatest difference we can make is simply letting another person know that they have truly been seen.